Hello, I'm Sandy Mamoli,
And I'm David Mole.
and together we're professional matchmakers. We're pairing people with the team they actually want to be in.
I love it. Well, thank you both for joining us and to our listening audience for tuning in. This is the Agile Uprising podcast, if you forgot to see it when you clicked play. I'm Andy Cleff, and today we're diving into a story of evolution. How this crazy radical Kiwi idea about letting people choose their own teams, my God, what were you thinking, became a mainstream practice. Joining me today from I assume you're at home base in somewhere near Auckland.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
Sandy Mamoli, David Mole, and authors of the original and newly updated second edition, Creating Great Teams, How Self-Selection Lets People Excel. David, this is your first time on our show. Welcome to the madness.
Thanks, Andy. It's really, really nice to be here. It's funny watching your cats run around in the background as we speak as well.
She seems to think it's feeding time, which is always for her, and she doesn't have thumbs, so that's a bit of a problem. Sandy, you and I and Paul Elia spoke in 2017 about self-selection when your first edition came out. And I think the book had been out for a little while. Was it 2015 it was published?
Yes.
I was reminded of that conversation. I was chatting with the CTO of a relatively small startup, and he was absolutely convinced, you know how this story goes, that the engineering managers needed to assign people to teams. I'm sure that sounds familiar to many of our listeners. In that first edition of your book, you shared the story of the early days at TradeMe. And for those that aren't familiar, it's the equivalent of eBay for New Zealand. Take us back to that experiment in self-selection at scale, right? It was something like 500 people across 3 different geographic locations. What possessed you to try something so radical?
To this day, we are asking ourselves the same question.
10 years later.
Yes. And I can't believe that we're going back 10 years actually. And it's a really cool thing that we spoke 10 years ago, we're speaking again now. And in between, we haven't been on podcasts, but we still kept the contact. And I think that it was a very cool thing to do. But taking us back to the old days of 2015, I do remember that we were at this New Zealand version of eBay, and we were in the process of going from just having project teams randomly going, and you are on the project, to going, hey, actually, we should have real teams, and trying to figure out how to do that. And while we were in that process, we had Ship It Day. And for those who don't know what Ship It Days is, it's you've got 24 hours, and you find whoever you want to work with on whatever you want to work on. And we kind of had a tradition of doing Ship It Day, and it was my first Ship It Day. And I remember coming home being completely enthusiastic. I enthuse easily. Being enthusiastic, being super happy, and going, oh my God, this was so awesome. Like watching people who just put themselves on one team, one thing they were passionate about it, and they just sorted it out who they wanted to work with and who they needed. And I went home and I started writing about it, and then all of a sudden I thought, oh, this is so sad. It should be like this every single day. It's so sad we can't do this. And then it just went boom. I thought, who says?
Right.
And then I raced back to work, got on my little bike, raced back to work, and went, David, this is what we got to do.
David, what was your initial reaction?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I remember thinking back to that time that like lots of good things come out of frustration, don't they? So I think Sandy raced back on her little bike and caught me at a moment of frustration. And the frustration was the spreadsheet that we were using at the time in this little version of TradeMe. It became this mega spreadsheet of doom with everybody's name in there. And we were trying to move people around to find the right teams. And I was part of the management team there at the time. And Sandy probably caught me just as I was coming out of another meeting where we were talking about who should go where on which project. And we were debating not matching people's skills. We were debating, well, this person can't work with that person because they hate each other secretly. And this person worked with them last time and they used to drive them mad. So we were spending hours in front of the spreadsheet, never being able to get it right, always being frustrated with the outcome. And I think that's probably when Sandy tapped me on the shoulder and said, actually, I've got an idea. And I think 9 times out of 10, or usually we would go, self-selecting teams, no way. But the coincidence of Sandy's inspiration and maybe the struggles we were having with management selection just meant that there was this maybe. No, it's insane. It's definitely insane. We should definitely not do that. And the good news is that Sandy is someone who wouldn't take no for an answer and wouldn't go, oh no, okay, of course we won't. She'll go, no, that's even more reason to do it.
You tell me it's not possible.
Yes,
I,
yes.
I take you on. Let's go. So here we are a decade later, and it's delightful to see how something that was once considered radical, if not downright fucking nuts,
Yeah.
has become increasingly common practice. Without giving away the whole book, because yes, we do want people to read it and enjoy it, highlight some of the things you've learned over these past 10 years since that initial trade me frustration with the spreadsheet blossomed into this might really work. Maybe key discoveries, surprises, myths that got busted, experience that changed your thinking or other people's ideas that changed it from radical to what it is today, mainstream.
Yeah. I think it's funny. I think as much as we paint a funny picture of how it started, I think we both believed it could work. So I think in some part of our brain somewhere, even though we laugh about us as a crazy idea, it's insane. We both kind of, it really fitted with what we believe, like at our core, around autonomy and around kind of what sits in the middle of Agile. So we believed it would work, but we probably didn't really believe it until we saw it. So it was kind of like, yes, we think this will work. We'll try this. We'll get people together. We'll help them self-select. But even then, probably we're still slightly skeptical. A bit like when I mean, I'm a runner, so when I'm training for a run, I believe I will be able to do the race fast. But when you run the race fast, you're like, wow, that was great. And I even impressed myself, maybe. So our self-selection journey was a little bit similar. We believe it was true, but then the evidence we built up, the small trial initially, the larger kind of event we went into, all just reinforce this idea that actually, yeah, we're not, it's not just working. The energy and positivity it was creating was probably like nothing else we'd done before.
And when you do the right thing and you're doing the right thing, then you have to do it, but you're not sure about the how. And I think that was the main areas of where we learned how to do this, how to do it in different contexts, how to deal with that many people, how to deal with leaders and managers who were maybe skeptical. So all those how-tos we learned, and we learned when we did it the first time, and we learned even more. We did it the second time and the fifth and the 10th time, and we learned from other people who did it. So the learning was very much in the exact how, but not so much in the what. And I'm to this day surprised how little has actually changed in the core of the principles, of the guidelines, of even the process and the framework, and how everything is everything else is just tweaks that are context dependent, but how the core has stood the test of time.
Oh, that's incredible. As all experiments, there's success and failure. Share with us some failures. You can change the names of the guilty parties that taught you something important about self-selection as a process, as a mindset.
How long's this podcast?
We could trim it down or speed it up. Do a highlight reel
Yeah.
because I love failure with learning, and sometimes, failure without learning. Well, yeah, shame on us. But when you learn something, it could be context specific or it could be general. But pick a few that were memorable. Oh shit!
I mean, I have so many, I could just keep going.
Is that the third edition? Like, don't try this at home.
Yeah, how to stuff it up. We have some examples in our book, but let me just start out with one before I hand over to David's big failures. One of my favorite ones was a larger company in New Zealand, and we had decided that it's probably best if managers aren't present because then people make the choices they would without feeling pressure of going one place or another. And what we overlooked was we had this beautiful room and it was overlooking the waterfront and it was like beautiful glass walls everywhere. And then we had this great idea, but if the managers were needed, it'd be cool if they just sat right outside and so we could get them. And at some point we realized, the walls are made of glass. It's basically if they're in the room. And we realized having managers in the room or behind a glass wall makes no difference. And it's a really bad idea because people start second guessing about what would my manager want me to do in this situation. And yeah, that was one of, I think, the worst experiences I have had with self-selection. Dumb idea.
Thank you for being so brave and courageous and sharing that. Pull the blinds, people. Pull the blinds.
Who wants to select in a goldfish bowl? Let's try this in real life. Do you know there are a whole bunch of failures. Two that come to mind. One was really early, and that was in our first ever trial, where we had this idea of just get people in a room, let them pick their own teams. Isn't that a wonderful idea? And it is, obviously, it's a wonderful idea, but we didn't really have the method behind it. And I remember how underplayed we did the visualization on our first trial. So we had little index cards, and I don't write very neatly anyway. So some of those had names on and titles on, but no one could really read it. And we had about 20 wonderful people in the room. They were absolutely, we started with the best and brightest. But even they struggled to self-select with the kind of poor, half-assed visualization that we had at the time. So you couldn't really see who was in which team, and this person seemed to have their name up a couple of times. And I remember being stood around them, kind of being devastated at our own attempts at visualizing who was where. And I think there's great learning comes out of that. And that's why we've now got what I think is a much better method of making things visible and making the problem easier to solve then. But I remember at the time being stood there with people when it's too late to redraw things going, oh, we really should have put more effort into how we make things look. So that was one. And the other ones that come to mind are to do with time. And I think I've seen organizations say, all right, self-selection, yeah, we could do that. Are you free in half an hour? Let's get the people together. And my initial reaction would be, what? There's so much preparation and thought that needs to go into this, and we need to be really clear that we can articulate the purpose of the team so that people know what they're joining. So you've got both extremes of failure of let's do this in half an hour's time, and oh, we might need to spend 6 months really getting things aligned and finishing other pieces of work and really slow this things down. So I think visualization and timing come to mind for obvious screw ups, and then there must be many more examples in between.
I'm curious how context impacts things like preparation. Small companies to large enterprises. Take a traditional, highly regulated industry like baking to some cutting edge startup. We use the framework to rule all frameworks, or yeah, we don't frameworks. What's a framework? Talk to us a little about how context matters or doesn't.
It's hugely different. And what's not different is the actual process and how you do it. And not even the preparation that much. What is different is the weaknesses you have to deal with. So if I have a small startup, the failure pattern is exactly as David mentioned. Hey, this is really cool. Let's take half an hour. Everyone go to a meeting in an hour. Like we got this done. It doesn't work like that because people who organize that self-selection forget the people element and taking people on the journey and so on, even in a startup. So in a startup, I usually coach and help people with going, no, 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 slow down a little bit to get people on the journey with you. In bigger organizations, it's the opposite. It's this complete over planning. Let's have 50,000 constraints of that many juniors, that many seniors, that many of this specialty, and that many of the other. And they make it so complicated and over plan and over prepare that they almost take the self-selection element out of it so that there only is like one or two solutions. So in that case, I push the other way. It's just chill out, fear constraint. It's an actual constraint. It's an actual self-selection and not a almost hidden management selection because you don't leave people options. So while the process and the preparation is almost the same, the failure patterns are different, and I need to push one in doing more prep and the other one pushing into doing less prep.
I think that's totally right. So in those big financial institutions, it's almost like you take all the regulation and constraints that people complain about. Like if you work with those organizations, they're frustrated by the regulations and constraints. And in the conversation around self-selection, we apply those same things that absolutely should exist when you're moving money around, but shouldn't exist when you're moving people around in a team selection. And we apply regulation. And as Sandy said, oh, we want to do self-selection, but also each team must have this 36-point checklist at the end of it, which makes the problem completely unsolvable for managers or self-selection. It really doesn't matter. So I totally agree with what Sandy's saying. If actually you say, no, come over here to this space where we can reduce those things. And ironically, if it's a startup and they want to do it tomorrow, you're actually saying, no, let's put at least two rules in place. Otherwise, people won't know what team they can choose. So you're just trying to find that middle area.
I want to switch gears out of process and setup and talk a little bit about philosophy of practice. When I've done this, and maybe listeners as well, the biggest barrier has not been concerns about getting the process right or too many constraints or not enough constraints. Although, as you described, that's often a red herring. Like, we got to get the process right, we got to get the right constraints. Like, no. And instead, the real barrier, and this is going to sound cliche, is mindset. This isn't going to work. So what have you discovered over these decades and multiple trials about the philosophical underpinnings that make self-selection work? Core principles, for example.
Yeah. For me, the core principles come back to, and maybe this is a coincidence, but before we did self-selection, we, like everybody else seemingly in the world, or at least in our bubble, read Daniel Pink's amazing book on autonomy, mastery, and purpose. I think if you think back, 15 years ago, everyone was watching the video, reading the book, and talking about that. And I think what underpins self-selection is exactly those three things: autonomy on which team you choose, mastery because you pick the team where you can learn, and making the purpose of those teams really, really clear. And I think those are three threads that just go right through self-selection back then, today, and in between. And if anyone's got a question around process or the how, like you were saying, really we want to peel that back to, well, does that give the person more autonomy, or which team can they learn most in? And it comes back to those three things. And actually, I feel like this is a claim to fame, but when we did our early work, we got an email from Daniel Pink because we'd been using his name, saying how great he thought the idea was. And it was a one-line email. He probably spent 12 seconds sending it, or his PA did it for him. But we've saved that email because it feels like that is his work is at the core of everything we've done, and we're kind of proud to have built on that.
And I believe the framed picture you see behind David, that's probably a printout of Daniel Pink's email.
I was going to ask, can you zoom in there a little bit? So I remember, and my timeline brain is totally borked, but the two of you published your HIP survey for team engagement, which leveraged Daniel Pink's work, right? It took it from the individual of autonomy, mastery, and purpose and put it into the team concept of, okay, what's my general level of happiness? Maybe not the best word because it leads to complacency sometimes, but innovation and sense of purpose. And I see that weaving in as well. Do you still run the HIP survey anywhere?
In many cases, yes, we do.
Yay, it lives on.
It does. It's as applicable as it was ever. And one thing that has happened is, and I think that is happening in the entire agile coaching scene and the entire agile scene, that we have learned that we some of the language we chose 15 years ago was unfortunate, and we pushed ourselves into the fluffiness where it's not just about being happy and complacent, it's about being content with high performance, being content doing great work. Those were words of the time. Now I would choose slightly different words. We are still using the survey, but very often with more contemporary words.
David, you talked about running, and before the show, we talked about exercise routines. I can't say I'm happy at the beginning of a run, but at the end, I do feel content. And I'm glad I've done it. And it's the same thing. And I'm curious if there's still at scale the need for a manager of sorts. There's not total autonomy and self-direction. And the manager's journey, what is the purpose of the manager, when they have to let go of control? If I'm a manager, what do I do if I'm not telling people where to go? How has that evolved and shown up in practice?
I want to keep us right there where you took us a moment ago, Andy, and that's the field of sports. And very much like a coach or a manager in sports, the job is not to tell people exactly where to move and how to move and what to do. The job is creating the environment. The job is giving direction, supporting, coaching, and creating an environment where this is possible. And I believe, and I've seen with self-selection, if you take away that micromanaging, taking away all this time being spent, not just designing teams, deciding who goes where, but also listening to the whinging for people who want to swap, dealing with the complaints, dealing with the abdication of responsibility, being asked all the time, what should I do next? It's really freeing. We had a really good manager who said it took him a couple of months where he came out of like, oh, where's the fire? What should I do? To just like a meerkat going up and then sitting down going, actually, there's nothing. And realizing how amazing that is, because now you can think strategically. Now you can do the things that are important and not just the things that are urgent. It's a switch, but from what we hear, everyone is ultimately really happy about it, even though it might be hard in the beginning.
Yeah, a bit like the runs you were describing, Andy, hard in the beginning, but better off once you've done it. And I think it's worth calling out that myth. We're talking about moving from management selection to self-selection, but that does not mean we're on some crusade to get rid of management or leadership. We are absolutely not. And we all know and love and appreciate good management and leadership. We're talking about removing a part of what currently falls to a leader, which is team selection, take that away, give that to the people involved so that, as Sandy was just saying, they can focus on the most important parts of their role, on the strategy, on what comes next, on helping individuals grow, whatever that really important part of management might be. So we're not trying to remove the role, we're trying to actually empower that person as much, if not more, as we're empowering the person who's now choosing their own team.
When we proposed this a couple of times, the resistance we got from management, and I believe it's based in fear, like so much of resistance. What if what if my people make the wrong choice? How have you addressed that fear?
And they will. Some people will make the wrong choice, and the teams you get at the end are not going to be perfect. But if you, as the manager, make the selection, you will get it wrong too. And you won't have perfect teams either. So it's a question of relative comparison. Who do you think does a better job? Plus, there's a few more things that I bring up with management when we talk about this. Like one, first of all, don't believe you get it right. Two, there is no perfection. Three, if you do have people select themselves, there's a better chance of making it work because people chose, they want to make this work, so they put more effort into this. They have a bigger chance because they work with people they want to work with on something they want to work on. And ultimately, I always go back to the managers and go, hey, it's really low risk. You do this, it doesn't work. There's a plan B, which is do what you've always done.
Get out your spreadsheet.
Yeah, go back to the spreadsheet. I mean, there's that idea, isn't it, of one-way and two-way doors decisions. And this is absolutely a two-way door decision. We make some choices, we form some teams. If they don't work, we can change that on an individual or a team level. So the worst case is not so bad, I don't think. And I think the other thing that sits behind that question of like, what if they make the wrong choice is someone thinking, what if, because there is no wrong choice. The person can and should go where they need to go. So there isn't a wrong choice. So I think what they might be saying is, what if they don't pick the thing I would have picked for them? I think that's what they're really worried about is all these people making choices that they wouldn't have made and people ending up therefore in different spots. So part of it is fear driven, like you said, Andy, and part of it is control driven. And it's letting go of that control to see what it looks like. I think the first time we did self-selection, we all knew all of the people involved really well. We've been working with them for years, and we could kind of guess where they might end up or predict where we would have put them. And you know what? People didn't follow that at all. We looked at the end result and we're like, whoa, I never would have thought that you would want to work on this. I never would have thought you would work with that person. Wow. So the results were surprising even when we knew people. And we were able to kind of go, but that's great. And as Sandy said, even if it wasn't the best choice or it was an imperfect choice, because they'd been involved in the decision, what happened after the event was people made it work. They found ways to solve problems, fix old conflicts, or start working with someone new because they'd been involved in the choice.
And I think a little life advice from Sandy, which is I think it's really human that if there is something we don't know, there's high uncertainty, there's a big unknown, we worry. When we worry about something big and unknown, we don't know what to worry about. So the brain makes up concerns. And we always end up worrying about the wrong things. So everything people ever worry about, it doesn't happen. It's totally different things that happen. So in those cases, and that's my life advice, might as well do it and deal with the actual problems that happen rather than the worries that never eventuate.
I love it.
Sandy's passed on that life advice to me many times. It's been very useful.
Yeah, what you're worried about is not the right thing. So the world of work has changed since yesterday, since last year, since 10 years ago, since that first self-selection event where combination of in-person, remote, hybrid, all kinds of things have shown up. Has the self-selection adapted or needed to adapt for these different contexts that weren't maybe not so common, we didn't even think about in 2015?
Absolutely. And as I said earlier, the core hasn't changed, but we now have hybrid and remote. That isn't that big a change. That is tweaks to technology, tweaks to what's synchronous, what's not synchronous, being virtual. So there's some mainly process changes and changes in times of communication. So not that big a deal, actually. What I personally thought was a way bigger deal in terms of context is the speed at which teams are being formed and reformed. We are pulling way more over, very often over into dynamic teaming and reteaming, where teams need to be formed more frequently. And I've seen companies going as frequently as every other week because they are heavily downsizing, for example. They don't know who is going to be here next week. They need to have new mixes. They don't know which work is coming in. So I know of a company that's self-selecting every other week and speeding up that extremely. And that's quite unusual. But in general, I think the tendency is to go more dynamic and faster. And that, I think, is a big influence on how self-selection has changed.
I'm curious about the every other week and Tuckman rolling over. They're making it work.
Yep.
Wow. That would be a great case study just to understand how things can be so dynamic and fluid and working agreements easily understood and modes of conflict and decision making not having to be reinvented every other week.
There's a point there, Andy, though, around I don't think what we're doing there is every team is changing every person. We're throwing all the cards in the air. So this has been a big change for self-selection over the years, where it's a big event to bring people together and then new teams form. I think what Sandy's describing is this really interesting area now where it's more dynamic and there's less focus on the event and more on, okay, for the next 2 weeks, this person has to join this team over here. Or we're going to merge these two teams because they've worked out they're working in the same space. So it's less of a all the cards being in the air every 2 weeks and more of a constant adaptation and evolving and maybe smaller movements, which reduces the amount of effort you might need, as you say, to kind of rebuild psych safety or reconsider how that team works from an agreement point of view. So it's kind of shifted to more of a less about the method and more about just the idea of it then lives on. We can move teams quickly and efficiently.
I'm hearing hints of Heidi Helfand's work and then the dynamic reteaming
Yeah.
modes.
Absolutely.
So you're leveraging those patterns and not doing what you did with 500 people 10 years ago. Okay, there are no teams, but at the end of this event, there will be teams. So it's not complete blank slate.
Very often it's not. Those are the teams we have. Now let's check what needs to change. And sometimes it's everything in the air. You have the chance to change. But what we find is people don't. So even if they have the opportunity to change every single person on every single team, I've never ever seen it happen. People usually, because they have chosen where they want to work, want to stay more than like 2 weeks or 6 months. They want to stay on, and you see just individuals moving on because they want to try something new. And it's actually it's not all chaos and totally redefining. It's adjustments. And the other thing I want to say about that is the first self-selection event, when you go from no teams or from management selected to self-selected teams, is a big deal. It needs lots of prep. But once it becomes a habit, it's a bit like the release process. The more often you do it, the easier it gets, the less painful it gets, and the less prep you need, and people know what's going on. You just need to get the new people up to speed. It's relatively easy, low effort, low prep, almost just a check-in with some movements.
That's the other life advice I think you've given me, Sandy, is if something's hard, you need to do it more. And that applies to all of these different scenarios, including self-selection. And you're right, Andy, it fits really nicely with Heidi's work on dynamic reteaming. That's exactly where we're ending up, where it's this beautiful combination of self-selection and dynamic reteaming. And as Sandy said, not everyone is moving, and actually the movements can be quite small. I think that's been quite a surprise for us whenever we've seen the kind of follow-up or worked with teams who once self-selected and what happens afterwards is there are definitely movements. It would be insane actually if no one ever moved team again after a self-selection. You'd be working in a different world than the one you chose. So there are definitely movements, but less than I would have predicted anyway.
And in terms of whose work we're drawing on, like we mentioned Heidi Halfand and her book, Dynamic Teaming and Reteaming, drawing on that. And the other one we have been drawing a lot is Amy Edmondson, Teaming, who talks about the same thing, the speed at which teams reform, but her focus is also very much on the skills and the ability that people now need to bring to the table in order to be part of this world where they can very quickly form new teams and be part of a team and collaborate with others.
It brings such power and resilience and innovation and creativity that other modes didn't offer. Your practices, and I've read it, the advanced copies of the book, have taken you across the globe. I'm curious what impact different cultures have on how you approach the event, debriefing, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting that we've now got either self-selections we've been involved in or we've heard about across multiple continents, dozens of countries. It really does seem to be an idea that's spread really well. And some of those we've seen and some of them we've just heard about. I haven't heard or found many cultural differences. I don't know. There are obviously, sorry, that's not true. There are obviously cultural differences that have impacted the way we self-select. I think the method and the values that sit behind it are true wherever you are, and you might adapt what your circles look like or at what point you explain the purpose of the team, but really it seems to work in each of these different cultures, regardless of what's sitting behind it. We haven't made active changes to it. We're like, well, we're working with you in country X. We must therefore change it in this way. So I'm not ignoring the cultural differences, but just that we seem to be working at a level which kind of underpins or kind of sneaks underneath them somehow.
Maybe the thing that is related to cultural differences is, as David says, there's absolutely no change in the process and the philosophy and the why. That is all the same. but sometimes the conversation before, during, and after the event is different. And I'm a big fan of Gert Hofstede's work on the power, what's it, the power distance index, how people relate to power and their managers. And you see differences there. So a person in Scandinavia, I have a very low power distance index. I have a different starting point when doing a self-selection from someone from maybe I think Asian cultures are very high on that index. So, how do I, for example, as a coach, how do I work with fear? What's my starting point to ensure that people understand this really is self-selection and there's no manager who pushes them in any other way. That being said, like I'm Austrian, so I'm coming from the probably rude, obnoxious side of things. So in my own culture, I would tell people and myself, just calm down, be less direct, be friendly and empathetic. And so there are some differences, but it's the conversation before, during, and after more than anything else.
You just reminded me, Sandy, the other thing I can think of is there's culture in terms of where people come from, but there's also culture in terms of what time people come from. So a really interesting thing has been how your age has affected your response to self-selection. And I run the risk of being ageist here, but generalizing, the older you are and the more used to a management selection model you are, the more resistance you might have to the idea initially. Whereas what we've found with young people who've just entered the team or just come out of university is they not only embrace the idea, they almost expect self-selection. So we've gone to great lengths to explain the ideas behind it and how this is a big change for people. And we've had kind of this Gen Z response of like, well, of course, this is what I expect. I'll be in that team. Thank you very much. So there are definitely cultural elements here based on your previous experience and kind of how ingrained a management selection model might be. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course, but just as a general model, we've kind of been surprised by maybe both ends of that spectrum.
And I have to say, I struggle with that a little bit because we did surveys like, what did you think about self-selection? How do you enjoy it? And so on. And exactly what David said came out of it. And I have people, all the people like of my generation, and they are super grateful. Like, hey, this is awesome. I've never had the chance of doing this, and I love it so much. And thank you so much for making this happen for us. I feel very happy and proud of myself. And then there is lots of very young people who think this is entirely normal. What's the big deal? And of course, it should be like this. And I feel myself really conflicted with going, yeah, it should be like this. So it should be not a big deal. And then there's the other part of me go, hey, I want some attention and be grateful. I make this happen for you. So there's a bit of a, I don't know, schizophrenic element in me.
Yeah, I get that. Let's fast forward a bit more than the 18-hour time difference between New Jersey and New Zealand and think about emerging workplace trends. This month's, AI. We already talked about fluid team structures, dynamic reteaming, continuing evolution, or maybe reversal of remote work. I don't know what's going on across the planet. Return to office. How do you see self-selection adapting? Or, when we talk about when we meet again in 10 years for the third edition of the book, will we have personal jetpacks? Will we be talking about teleportation? Talk about dynamic reteaming on demand? All joking aside, back to serious. What do you see the next frontier look like? And how will self-selection adapt, sense, and respond to those things?
I get a feeling this is one of those conversations where we are like those people who predict the future and then they're completely ridiculed 10 years from now because it's so entirely wrong. But coming up with the best guess, a random guess. First of all, I hope we will be in this podcast and it will be utter silence because self-selection is so entirely normal that we've got nothing to talk about. So we'll just sip our teas and coffees and wine, whatever we have, and talk about something else. So I think I hope it's going to be a non-event and totally normalized. And if I'm completely wild, then maybe there will be self-selections and we'll have new team members and they will be our AI robot colleagues. And they have a right to self-select too. And we'll see how that pans out.
David, your thoughts? Your predictions. Get out the crystal ball. What do you see?
I agree with Sandy on how wrong we will definitely be. If you, obviously, everyone's talking about AI at the moment. If you think about what that impact might be on teams, those teams might get smaller because people are now, it's not just person, it's person supported by AI. So smaller teams still works with self-selection. So as Sandy said, maybe that means we're not talking about this in the future. The other thing that comes to mind with the kind of AI impact on this stuff is when we first did this, I remember some of our teams were half formed. So you'd get like six of the seven people you needed, and we'd have a gap. We'd write on a card at the time what our gap was. So we're missing marketing experience in this team, for example. And then we'd go away and recruit a person who had that experience and bring them into the team. And I wonder if there's a possible change here where that problem sort of goes away because we might have Brian on the team who knows nothing about marketing, but what about Brian supported by AI now who can bring in that expertise? So it might make the problem easier to solve and it might reduce some of the things you need to do afterwards. I mean, I'm talking more about self-selection than AI here, just in terms of my prediction would be we still have these teams, they're still small in nature, but maybe because of the impact of the additional things available to them, they can actually form those teams faster. The puzzle is easier to solve, and then we all fly away on our jetpacks, like you said.
Sorry to maybe totally put you on the spot, Andy, but I'd be super interested in what you think.
Wow, they turned the interview on to me, totally unprepared. Um, I am hoping it is, we are just cracking a beer and it is
Yeah.
so normal that it's a non-event and it's become so seamless and fluid and easy and responsive to the needs of the larger system that the organization, I want to say organism, I think it's an evolution of the organization as organism that senses and responds, and people just move. They go where the needs are and the skills or the desire to learn, and it just happens in a fluid nature. And there's very little planning and process, and it just happens.
Wouldn't it be great if in 2 years, never mind five, that it was as ridiculous to start a piece of work with management selection as it would be today to start a software project with a 2 year waterfall plan? Like, wouldn't it be great if that idea is kind of scoffed at, that we should no, we should stop everything and remove the dynamic stuff that you just mentioned, Andy. And no, we as managers must get in a room and fill out our spreadsheet. I'd love us all to be kind of laughing at that idea when we're sipping our coffee and wine in a few years.
Well, listeners, if you're still here and still paying attention, I hope the thought is, I need to try this in my organization. I can't wait another week, month, quarter. So before we wrap up, can you share, what resources you have available to help them get started on this journey of creating great teams with self-selection? Workshops, online, what do you offer?
So there is obviously the book, which is the Bible of anything self-selection. We also have a website, which is creatinggreatteams.com. And there you can find what we do and how we can help. We run 1 day workshops, we run half-day workshops, we do online classes, and we do consulting to help people prepare for their own self-selections. We also offer for anyone who has read the book to drop us an email and to have a conversation with David and me. And if they have small questions, happy to answer those. Did I forget anything, David?
I don't think so. So, did you mention that we're both part of Nomad Aid? So that's our kind of home, and that's where we live and we do our work and consulting from. So that's a website you can find. That's our email addresses. That's where we will be coming from to come and help you.
Awesome. Well, that brings us nicely to the end of our time box. Sandy, David, I want to thank you for sharing your time and your insights, and most importantly, your experience moving this forward when it seemed like a crazy idea. And it's proven to be so useful. So listeners, you can find links in the show notes to the second edition of their book, Creating Great Teams. And depending on when you're listening, it might be the beta version as an ebook, or it might be the print version coming out really soon this spring. Well, spring for me, winter for y'all. Final questions before we close. What makes you optimistic about the future of self-selection? There's so much distressing news out there. The end of the world is coming, driven by the crazy people at the helm in the US. What keeps you going? What makes you optimistic?
I was about to say, like, you guys are currently not helping very much with the state of the world. But what makes me optimistic is that it's the right thing to do. And I strongly believe that ultimately the right thing is going to prevail.
Yeah. And we've just got so much increasing evidence now that this works. You know, there might be a huge bias here, but just give me a small team that have chosen themselves to be on that team and that they're trying to tackle something meaty and try and do something good. Like that is both a point in time, but a point of optimism as well, because we could do so much with that. Just small groups of people who've had that choice as to where they work and what they work on, and then we can just let them go. And I'd be quite optimistic if those are the circumstances that we're working in.
Well, listeners, thank you for your time too. Look in the show notes. I'll put in links to Nomad 8's website, a group of, how do you describe yourselves? Passionate professional matchmakers. It's chock-a-block full of case studies, articles, and occasional creative rambling. It's really a delightful resource. If you enjoyed this show, share it with a friend, maybe your engineering manager who's busy biting their nails about this whole concept, or if you're really brave, your doubting CTO who says, "What, are you crazy? This will never work." And while you're at it, give us a review, a rating, leave some comments on your podcast platform of choice. I think that's it. Any final words from either of you two?
Just thank you so much, Andy. That was a really fun conversation. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us, Andy. It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, this is the Agile Uprising Podcast. Signing off.